Listo. ¿Listo? Ok, pues muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. We're so happy to be in this fourth conference on peace building from a gender perspective. We have panel 2. The university shall be feminist or not at all. Reflections on gender violence in the university. And this panel will be moderated by Dr. Claudia Alonso. Let me tell you about her and her professional experience. Dr. Claudia Alonso Gonzalez, full-time academic, faculty member responsible for gender studies of the Puebla Iberoamericana University, and she works in higher studies in social anthropology and member of the National System of Researchers, a candidate. She's done postdoctoral research, Colegio de Mexico and Metropolitan University. She's been teaching BAs and master degrees in different university and institutions. She's been working on gender perspective for many years. She's published different articles in specialized magazines. She's now doing research, approximation, sexual violence in BA studies of the Iberoamericana University in the state of Puebla. Thank you so much. We want to thank the Puebla Ibero University. I give the floor to Dr. Claudia Alonso, please. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this panel number 2. I want to start out with a very brief reflection on the national context in which we decided the topic for this panel, especially considering that some of the participating people in this Congress come from other countries. In Mexico, in the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen and the student collective intensification, and sometimes university students are claiming and denouncing gender violence. At the university sphere, they organized all types of political demonstrations, sit-ins, demonstrations, graffiti painting to denounce psychological violence, sexual violence, especially hostilities, harassment, and also rape and attempts of rape. And they have spoken about violence inside university facilities throughout many school activities. The mirror we now see gives us a reflection, inviting us to look at the major challenge we face, particularly universities, to give urgent response to reduce gender violence in our institutions. This violence has not only taken lives of university girls who are not with us anymore, but it is also silently affecting physical state, emotional state of many students in our country. This happens in a broader context at the national level, as we see an increase in claims of violence offenses. And we also see an increase of claims of violence against sexual freedom. That is between 2016 and 2019. Young girls are filing claims on this, but women of all ages as well. I want to share data with you that have to do with this increase. In the above mentioned period, sexual abuse crime increased 57%. 2019, 23,635 incidents, and rape increased 24% between 2016 and 2019. 13,660 incidents. Harassment and sexual hostility also grew. In 2016, we had 2,254 incidents. In 2019, 6,063. That is, the number had a threefold growth, practically. This is the Executive Secretariat of the National Security System in Mexico. Well, we're starting this panel with more prevention, less impunity, gender violence in the university sphere. Dr. Galilea Cariño Cepeda, she's a full-time faculty member responsible for violence prevention at the Ibero University in the state of Puebla. Dr. Galilea Cariño has a BA in law and criminal science teacher for the same institution. She has had honor mentioning for the work she has done. She has done a specialty in family violence and criminal execution at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. In the Castilla-La Mancha, Spain University, she did master's degree and PhD criminology and youth delinquency. She has also had many activities. She has been legal advisor for Integral Families Development in Puebla. She was judge for civil affairs in Tehuacan in the state of Puebla. She was teaching assistant at the National Education Ministry in Paris, France, and she was one of the founder and researchers of the Social Violence and Gender Violence Observatory in the state of Puebla. And in Puebla, she was responsible for the university program on human rights. And she has taught criminal law, criminology, family violence, and human rights in different universities in Puebla, psychology school, in the Alberto Hurtado University in Chile. She has done research and has made and given many conferences in countries like Bolivia, Argentina, Spain, the Czech Republic, Cuba, France, and Canada. Her main lines of work have been violence, human rights, people in prison, criminology with a gender perspective. She has participated in reports on human rights and hearings at the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. At the Ibero University in Puebla, she has coordinated research projects, special certificate projects, and she coordinated the Inter-University Latin American Human Rights Program, and she was the director of the Human Rights Institute, the Ignacio Curilla Human Rights Institute. What a pleasure having Dr. Galilea Cariño. I give her the floor to start her presentation. Please, doctor. Give me a few seconds. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I hope so. Yes, we can hear you. We are ready to hear your presentation.
Solamente que no te vemos.
We don't see you. You're cutting out and we don't see you at all.
Esperamos unos segunditos.
Let's wait a few seconds.
El Zoom sacó a nuestra ponente. Esperamos para su reingreso.
Let's wait for her to come back to the Zoom session. I apologize. Hello, everyone. I want to greet everyone participating in this great conference, this great congress. I want to thank all the Mexico City Iberoamericana University for organizing this, and Dr. Patti Castañeda. You have left a true memory in me when I participated with you in another event. And I want to thank the organizers and thank you for allowing us to participate. The first thing I want to share with you is the emotion and hope. When I read the program for your Congress, I remember reading the first draft. This constitutes an unprecedented opportunity to think about peace building in terms of macro context and the violence in those contexts, but also the way we communicate and the silences we have. I want to thank everyone, voices and hearts of different countries, of universities, civil society organizations, because today we can talk about community experiences, family, university, sports experiences, as well as public policies, cultural and labor policies. Let's see. Let's see. Am I still here? Yes. Can you see me? Yes, we can see you. Very good. I shall continue. Some of the slides I will be sharing, some of the reflections rather I will be sharing have to do with conditions around university violence, especially gender violence at the university level. I want to talk about the context, and the title of my presentation is The Background of My Work with a Diagnosis We Are Developing at the Iberoamericana University in Puebla. From university violence, looking for dignified spaces. And how do we react in Puebla? For this diagnosis, we started with a general question, especially with intention of identifying violences generated here in Puebla at the university level, but also recognizing actions that some members of the university are generating as a response. And institutional responses that may be formal or informal within the framework of what we see as university compliance. University violence has been a historic problem. It seems that just recently it has focused on becoming more serious through the design of protocols to overcome this problem. We've heard this year of many student mobilizations that started 4 or 5 years ago, but this year as well. But this year, not only at the higher education level, but also at the junior high and high school levels. So with other movements, this is showing the need people have to respond and do something about the problem. Some of the media and some social media as well say that the problem only has to do with harassment and hostilities. I would say this is a first coordinate we would have to analyze because it has to do with invisible violences that are silenced and recorded in the institutions themselves. The violence we now know does not explain many of those practices at the university level. They're not denounced. They are not identified. They are diversified, and they are seen as something normal. That's the way they are considered. We've been able to get information through the studies we have made through a mixed methodology, trying to deepen the understanding of techniques through questionnaires, surveys, and manifesto documents shared with students, with the media, some data recording cases at the university level, and other inputs to show some coordinates through two major axes. The first one, characterizing violence at the university level in Puebla. Second, identifying reactions of the university community vis-a-vis expectations and the institutional activities in the face of this situation. What do we know about violence? That's the question. People say, well, they're occasional. Violence is occasional. Psychological violence, harassment, discrimination, and hostilities. And violence of the boyfriend and girlfriend prevails. Psychological violence, which is part of the focus groups and the survey, is something that's not really denounced or even mentioned. This doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We will have to continue doing studies on this. Nonetheless, in this perception of psychological violence, this is linked to other expressions that are related or reinforced with sexist language and practices, humiliating girls, and also negligence, and also ignoring people, girls, that is. Some of the examples are as follows. The teacher usually picks one of the boy students because they say that the girls are not so good. They're not as intelligent as the boys. And sexual favors. Teams working on a certain assignment, and the girls end up serving the coffee because many think they are not as academic as the boys, and mocking or making fun of girls, using excluding language when talking to girls, or thinking that only boys can accomplish things. The best scientists are men. These are structures we found in this exploration process. The perception of violence, as Carrillo has said, we cannot say that at the university we can show more or less tolerance on certain types of violence and naturalized examples. We are also looking at the broadest sense in which the community defined what violence was to everyone in this community. Structural violence, moral, symbolic, institutional violence is almost non-existent, but physical violence, psychological violence are the most immediate references among the students' population here in Puebla. On the other hand, we also saw that student mobilizations, in our case here at the Ibero University in Puebla, well, there is a physical space called El Pizarrón, the blackboard, and the question was written, who has harassed you? And they gave names, students, teachers. So the Blackboard project was a watershed project. It allowed us to understand a problem that no one was seeing in the community, or almost no one. Let me give you a better example of this. The Blackboard process changed the perspective. It's not something that I can see directly. That's the movement, and I didn't know this existed. This is an answer from one of the students. This is an extract of one of the interviews. The next extract is also from a student. The Blackboard project was more from men to women, but I think all males required an internal valuation. Many of them were scared to be assessed or evaluated. Most of the boys were looking at the Blackboard. They were afraid their name would be up there. So they would go and check. You know, there are attitudes, and they know that they are doing bad things or that they are having bad attitudes, but they really do not know how to change the situation. So their names were put up on the Blackboard for everyone to see. And I hope this was also a way to readdress this type of dynamic that they have with other people at the university level. So this reasserts what has already been said in other spaces. Demands to pay more attention to this problem that seemed to be isolated, but it is not. The entire community is involved, especially in terms of experiences of impunity. In this experience of negative conditions, the girl students of the first semesters are the ones that are mainly harassed. But they have to create awareness in themselves of what's going on. They do that a few semesters after, sometime after they start the university level. And this has to do with student experiences in which students go to the university, and this is not people that are quite vulnerable, and students, collaborators, boys and girls. And let me give you some examples. This is also taking place in the first semesters. The girl didn't dare say anything. She dared months later to say what was happening to her. There's another very painful experience. This student is also talking about the Blackboard project. Yes, a lot of stress in the environment. It is terrible to know that your classmates have gone through terrible things, and it's really terrible to know that the boys you think are your friends can be turning you into a victim, and they take no responsibility on this. It is really bad to see the environment of distrust, but this has to become visible, end of quote. So with this, what about vulnerability? That is something any person can have. Anyone. For instance, people participating in feminist movements even, that has a cost sometimes. However, there are differences. I share the testimony of one of the students showing a classical environment of sexism, very hostile environment. That condition is mainly through inclusive spaces, feminist experiences that vindicate a fight, a struggle after so many negative experiences. I quote one of the students. She said, sometimes we don't recognize we are being violated. It's physical violence, and that's very noteworthy, but there are other violences that cannot be seen so easily. We don't think it's violence. So I think that's the way it is. We don't recognize someone is violating our rights. At the beginning, I thought that was the normal way of relating to boys, to men. I thought that's just the way it is. I have to adapt myself. I have to withstand this situation. Then I thought, no, this is not good. This is not working. I shouldn't be accepting this treatment. I shouldn't be accepting. This is not the right way to be treated. I think there are certain women's spaces, and there, in those spaces, I started understanding what was happening to me. I understood that I had a voice and that this voice mattered, and that what was happening to me was not normal. End of quote. So let me now say something of masculinities. I know we're going to have panels with people specializing on masculinity, but let me say a couple of things on this. Not much work is being done at the university level on masculinity. However, there are some experimental studies, but we haven't yet been able to study that type of process to know changes those spaces are generating in men, as Fernandez de Avilés points out. On the other hand, we're not identifying other resistances in the face of this attempt to deconstruct those masculinities. I think something that's in the poll has to do, or in the survey has to do with masculinity and analyzing it in a very periodical manner. Not just one workshop. We need more work. We have to continue asking what happens. How do we look at responsible fatherhood? What about a toxic relationship? What about situations of emergency? How do they continue building their identities? It seems that universities will allow people to have many experiences and emotions. Dynamic coexistence relations may also constitute very painful periods that are self-silenced, because those experiences have to do with cultural benchmarks people have learned that are reinforced at the educational level, virility and masculinity. Many actions are part of this, many actions that many people cannot tolerate, and they should be deconstructed. However, in everyday experiences, the option many of our students have at the university level depends on the culture of control and sexism and violence. I want to give you a description of one of the students. Quote, my first workshop helped me understand we're all vulnerable. And if we don't try to heal those wounds that we have, we are going to get sick, and we are going to continue with those ill practices, with those very bad practices. I cannot cry. There's nothing I can do. And I can tell you that I also have a problem. It's difficult for me to cry, but we have the right mechanisms for that. Yes, men say, I'm the king here. So it's difficult for me to cry when I hear that. I don't need any of that. Tonight, I am a boy. Tonight, I'm going out with the first girl. Why do I feel this way? The other classmate, also a boy, says, this is a serious problem. People hide their feelings. I think the most difficult thing is to keep everything to yourself. And masculinity says you can't express anything. You cannot be vulnerable. If someone had a bad day and he does not want to talk to anyone and he's in a bad mood, they said, well, you're a sissy and all types of names. So that boy is not allowed to say anything in his own group of friends. End of quote. This is another boy, one of the students of the university here. It's urgent to make everything visible. What is happening in our environment, considering effects of violence and what this is generating in people. We identify certain affectations in order of appearance: emotional, psychological violence, school performance, labor performance, insecurity, lack of trust, stress, and anxiety. Within the framework of the second part, which is the axis of how do we face up to these situations of violence, we have to say that our student population, the girls say they've been victims and they've gone to see the authorities. 19%, 18% went to university authorities and 1% to a civil authority. Internal authority. Let me quote what they said. 29%, the University Rights Division, and 13%, they went directly to the faculty members right in the school. Some spoke to teachers. This has to do with protocol on violence and discrimination. All this generates uncertainty in the decision-making process. When something like this happens, when a girl is the victim, well, 53% of the population said yes, that they know their rights and the documents, but 47% said they didn't. And we did a coding process through a software. We have positive and negative assessments on procedures and resolutions, but 16 positive assessments and 96 negative ones. They talk about obstacles to perceive insatisfaction vis-a-vis the resolution. And we have areas of opportunity, and they are part of this structure we are developing now in many of our universities. First, negative time conditions, especially because there are people who are victims. They believe they're not getting the right information on procedures and resolutions. So there's uncertainty in the timeline. They believe those behaviors may be repeated. There is a testimony saying that research time in resolution take about a semester, and people are always feeling bad throughout that time. Among other obstacles, lack of relevant information. Clear information is not always given. They never got the right information. There were no formal documents, no emails informing about continuity of their process. So they were quite discouraged. They didn't want to continue with the procedure. And there are cases that haven't been addressed, lack of appropriate investigation, and underestimating certain behaviors. We have testimonies on this. A girl said the coordinator didn't believe what I told him. Instead of supporting me, he supported my classmate that had been part of this violation. And many of the girls were told, rather, don't report it. There are also things related to discretional decisions, protecting the boys, and there are alternative actions and that have nothing to do with institutional procedures. They have to do with other practices. And the victims usually have to resort to other methods like yoga classes and things that make them feel a little better after the violation because there is no response from the authorities. On the other hand, one of the victims said, the authority I went to said, just forget about it and go have some coffee with the attacker. And I don't think this is right. And there's a very strong patriarchal agreement here. End of quote. These are the types of answers we were able to get in this survey. In terms of other things and procedures, yes, the competent instance is the university rights. Co-responsibility, we have, all of us in the institution, has different levels. We have voids in research and resolving the cases. There's a chain of people, and we all have our own perspectives, and many of us lack the necessary information. Therefore, sometimes we can underestimate the behavior and we start negotiating something that should never be negotiated. And the victim sometimes is recriminalized instead of having justice served. A teacher here said that she started working in a new division and she was explained all the protocols and she thought, well, what about the students? Have I been guiding them correctly? And this is part of a first level of information. Many of the victims have to cover that path. Those practices that have to do with misinformation have to have results, challenging mechanisms in terms of possible cover-up process at the institutional level and in terms of the pain of victims. To close, the resolution was very slow and it was thinking about the benefit or institutional risks and doing nothing. Doing something is better than doing nothing, I thought. And a man was in charge of this process, and everyone supporting this man were other men. So university support was for men and from men and for men. So who was listening to us? Who was really listening to us? We think that based on those expressions, we can unveil certain institutional practices until we find impunity. That's what we always find. So to look into this diagnosis, a lot of the things we've been able to get to strengthen standards and different instances comes from collaborative work. And this comes from feminisms and the sisterhood of students and teachers and collaborators. They've been using their own resources and their own practices and narratives of their own experiences. For instance, in the university rights division. We're working on human rights with a gender perspective, restorative justice focused on the victim. This has to do with the testimony of the victim. And this is what we found in this survey. But as we have heard from the Brazilian Women's Union, yes, sometimes we find many accomplices of violence. We have to have a violence-free life. This is what we're working on so that universities may have spaces without reproducing stereotypes and subordination, because this is something against our freedom, our security, our safety, and integrity. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much. I will be more than ready to answer your questions when the time comes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Galilea. And now let's give the floor to the next speaker, Patricia Castañeda Salgado. She is a researcher of the Interdisciplinary Center in Sciences and Humanities of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where she does full-time research. Her presentation is Feminist Research as a Resource for Transformation of Universities, the case of a safe and secure national university. She is an anthropologist, the founder of the Feminist Research Program for the Research Center that does interdisciplinary humanistic research. At the National University of Mexico, she works with indigenous rural community women. She works on gender violence, genocide, and she has also studied feminist anthropologies in Spanish-speaking countries. She is the member of the National Researchers Institute and Program. She's working on an individual project, feminist anthropologist in Spanish-speaking countries, and she participates in various collective projects like building relationship of equality in indigenous communities, the National Coordinating Body of Indigenous Women. This is a Flaxo-funded project, and social family intervention, community intervention projects, and social impact, and COVID-19 from the gender perspective in Mexico City. And she works in social policies of Mexico 2000 and 2018. All funded by the National University of Mexico. She teaches at the postgraduate Latin American program, and she works with tutors of this postgraduate studies, also in anthropology and social work, both of UNAM. She's been participating in different examining commissions of the National University, as well as in other foreign commissions and editorial boards. She's published her own books and with others as well, and she has written many articles for magazines and different publications. And she works in the feminist working group Resistances and Processes in the National Council and the Mexican Association of Rural Studies, of the Latin American Network of Feminist Anthropology, and the Social Anthropologist and Ethnologist College that she is chairing now in the 2019-2020 period. What a pleasure having Dr. Patricia Castañeda. I give you the floor, Patricia, so that you can start your presentation, please. Thank you so much, Claudia. What a pleasure being here with you to share this space with highly appreciated colleagues. I also want to thank the organizers of this event And I'm so happy to be able to share with you this information, different characteristics of feminist research, but the different possibilities as well of this specific way of social relationships. Let me start out with one of the premises that has already been mentioned, at least for about 3 or 4 decades at the academic level. Feminist research has a fundamental purpose, which is knowing to transform. This premise, highlighting the practical order of research, we have to remember that this is research generated at the academic field level, but it also gathers things that are happening in non-academic worlds with colleagues, with feminists, with neighbors, with members of different social groupings who have set out for a long time now to gather information and generate knowledge on the situation and condition of women in Mexico and the world, with a fundamental purpose of documenting the situation, but also finding answers and solutions to the terrible problems that we now face. In this sense, feminist research has the main purpose of generating knowledge that will be contributing towards the transformation of structures, relations, and organizational forms, thoughts, and mentalities, mindsets, ideologies of all fields, social, economic, political, cultural levels that are the basis for social inequality. But above all, we're interested in highlighting those inequality, those conditions rather that are at the basis of gender inequality that's opening enormous gaps between men and women. Particularly then, the relevance of this research is to know in a very specific manner what that inequality is all about in a very deep fashion, knowing about women's experiences, expectations, and proposals for modifications. In this sense, I think that feminist research may contribute towards everything that's still pending and those loopholes and voids that are there, especially of people that are part in a social, cultural, and political entity. In terms of institutional actions, it's as of this connotation that I think that feminist research of the National University on the university done by university people is indispensable. Feminist research on the university may highlight all those relations, expectations, knowledge, and are part of the university community. As of that point, we have to consider what are gender relations like and what are the types of gender relations we see and how can we establish the necessary bridges that may trigger this and situations so that we may solve these problems that so many women are suffering throughout their history, but particularly in recent years. And we shouldn't forget that women, we've arrived late at the university sphere. From a general perspective, it wasn't until the end of the 19th century when women gradually were incorporated in university spaces, in different university careers, professions. This process has continued, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, in different careers that were considered as feminized careers. There are many careers in which women arrived very late, or they're just barely arriving in those careers. This gradual incorporation has generated many violent conditions against women because historically they are occupying spaces that were not thought or made for them. This is one of the reasons for which today gender violence at the university level is a problem we have to highlight. It is true that gender violence is a nationwide problem. That's the way it should be considered. I will never be too tired to say this. This is not a problem of women. This is a social problem. This is a problem that is really having an impact on society at large. It's also true, however, that gender violence at the university levels has very specific characteristics because of the historic background. We women have been occupying places of recognition as generators of knowledge, not only as transmitters of knowledge. Whereas, women started incorporating in universities as teachers, for instance, this was tolerated by some, or people were trying to see this with the good eyes with a feminine connotation because they were associated to social reproduction and the transmission of knowledge. But as women started participating in research, in the creation of knowledge, they were also incorporated into places where they had never been recognized. We have seen that the university has become one of spaces of systemic violence, as we have seen, as mentioned by Galilea a few minutes ago. This violence, which is epistemic, has not been persecuted. People don't study the roots of this type of violence enough. And we have to remember that at the university level, there are students who are the raison d'etre of the university. They are non-academic employees, and many are university officials with high-ranking posts at the university. This is quite a comfortable position for men, and this turns into violence against women, and this is kind of standardized or normalized violence against women at the university level for many years now, with an academic event weighing the role of universities. Marcela Lagarde spoke about the institution. She said it was a mixed space of inequity. This is a definition that has been so useful for us within the university sphere to characterize this institution as a political institution in which we have the reproduction of logics that characterize society of which women are a part. Well, this means that the university, with all this very peculiar characteristic, is still part of a society. It reproduces characteristics of that society. Well, within this framework, we would also have to say that universities in Mexico and globally are institutions requiring urgent, substantial changes in terms of gender perspective, and violence is an indicator of those inequalities. As we have started studying the situation of violences of gender within higher education institutions, we have deepened our study on the need of knowing the conditions that give sense or make those violations have certain type of sense. Why do they have sense? How can we be sensitized? Why can we stop looking at it as a problem alien to the university, a problem just between two individuals? Therefore, it is not the responsibility of the university institution. It has nothing to do with solving the problem. This is the way things are being seen. So file a claim, and what is the position of the university students, the girls? All these things have led are deciding something has to be done on this situation. And we've had legislation, we've had public policies, nationwide policies, and different commitments made by the Mexican government in terms of the sanction and eradication of violence in Mexico. That means that it is now an obligation for university authorities to see their space as a space of intervention on those problems and issues. Therefore, a few years ago, we started doing research on this. Those of us that are in the Feminist research program of the Interdisciplinary Center, and we are working on this, and we are doing research, particularly in terms of a research project, which was a diagnosis to prepare a model on this, on safe universities.
Antes que nada, pues quienes participamos en el programa, además de ser
Those who
investigadores,
participate in the program, not only do we work here,
primera
but
mano
we know
de
firsthand
nuestros
the
estudiantes
concerns
que
of a
cada
lot
vez
of our
más
students,
se quejaban
and
de la
more
violencia
and
de la
more,
que eran objeto.
they knew about the violence that they were being subjected to, but we were also concerned about how this was being focalized, gender violence to certain manifestations that maybe because they were the hardest, they were still the tip of the iceberg. And we started asking ourselves if this public and private distinction that is being done could be taken to the university to know what happens within the spaces of the schools, centers, research institutes, and other university places of what happens outside at the campus.
¿Cuáles serían las condiciones de seguridad y
And
de
we started
inseguridad
asking ourselves what
que
would be the
enfrentarían
conditions
los estudiantes en estos espacios abiertos y públicos de la
that the
universidad?
students would go through in these open spaces at the university.
Hablando del campus central, el famosísimo campus de Ciudad
At
Universitaria
UNAM,
y particularmente
we're
la
talking about the central campus and also the historical area that has been acknowledged as a heritage of humanity by UNESCO. When we started asking ourselves about this condition for safety or lack of safety, the idea was to be able to identify what were the conditions in order to make proposals for changes in safety in order to strengthen this safety or security conditions. And in theory and politically speaking, the terms of safety or lack of safety, they're linked with this different perspectives and with the need to implement models of controlled safety that was geared, that was not part of the perspective that we wanted to explore. For this reason is that we moved from this model in order to see the perspective of human rights, not only from the feminist perspective, but particularly from the feminist focus that takes all of this as a reference in order to diagnose that could be useful for the look for information that would allow to transform the state of things. That's how we started putting together an investigation, interdisciplinary, interinstitutional project where with the participation of different researchers from 4 different places at UNAM, the center that I belong to, the National School of Social Work, the University Program for the Environment, and the University Program of Studies in the Cities. And for this methodology, we took back the proposal of the model of safe cities for everyone that has been implemented in Latin America, particularly under the support of The teacher, Maria Teresa
responsable
Rodriguez, that is responsible for the program of the cities in the Americas. We were looking at the proposal to adapt it to the situation at UNAM.
mi pantalla con ustedes para
I'm going to be sharing my screen now so I can show you different things with respect to this investigation and diagnosis. And tell me if you can see this properly.
Ay, perdón.
I'm sorry.
¿Ahora sí la ven bien?
Can you see this?
Se ve, nada más hay que poner en presentación. Muchas gracias.
Perfecto. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que queríamos diagnosticar? Esa era la
What did
primera.
we want to diagnose? That was the first question. We wanted to diagnose the perception and the experience of the students with respect to safety and lack of safety, and then this move towards knowing if they know the right to mobility, how to execute and exercise this right under the premise that every person must have the necessary conditions to really execute that right to move freely in any space, but
Espacio
basically
público es
any
un
public
indicador
space.
de
It's
la
an
medida en la
indicator
cual las
of the
condiciones
way
de
in which the conditions for lack of safety and eradication of violence go hand in hand.
y aplicamos
That's why we take over this perspective and we look at the analysis proposed by the proposal of the methodology of
como
human rights studies to see if UNAM,
al Estado
as institutional equivalent, has been fulfilling all of this to guarantee the right for everyone within the university.
Aquí va. Y en la propuesta metodológica, entonces, además de implicar
And the
estos
proposal, not only does this imply all of these premises that we have seen, we thought that it was very important to look at any investigation that could be replicated to other spaces in UNAM, other campus, and also that could be useful to other universities, and also that could be a model that could be updated to be able to assess the progression of everything that we were interested in. So what are the expectations? Well, to have equal access to the spaces at UNAM, and regardless of their condition, gender, and cultural and gender diversity, and without any concern in any public spaces, public transportation by the university. I don't know if Iberoamericana University in Puebla has the same service, and that it would be equivalent to this type of transportation. And we also see that the mobility is associated with the infrastructure and the conditions. And then we would need to have a set of conditions that would allow women to move according to their freedom, autonomy, and citizenship. What we have found after using a mixed methodology with all of these parts of quality and quantity, where we bring together questionnaires, a census, direct observation to participants, groups of reflection, and to gather proposals. We have found that in the right to mobility free and safe, that's far away, but those are the expectations. And these are gender, ethnic conditions, orientation, and sexual preference or orientation, sexual preference, and physical disabilities. And we have been able to look at this because the groups of research were set up together with looking at they were not only mixed. They could be students, people from the academia, workers from the university, as well as people that are foreign to the university that use the spaces. We also called upon indigenous peoples that had different sexual preferences and with problems and disabilities, all of them linked to the university to look at this. This is a right that is restricted by, the different bias and gender that are sexist. And this is part of university relations. And this is also have an obstacle of an egocentric institutional authorities. But even though we have moved forward in gender perspective, it doesn't have an institutional policy of equality. So this is something that UNAM is working on, but it's still in the process.
Está abierto un micrófono. Gracias. Algo muy importante fue que entre las personas que
Something very important is that among the people that were participating in the investigation, there was a perception of lack of trust and concern about the security personnel at the university. And this talks about parallelisms that are established between the university and the surroundings, where you can see the rest of the city, the rest of the country, and also this mobility is limited because there's deficient infrastructure and urban mobility that has a privilege in vehicle mobility more than the mobility of pedestrian, and this affects those that have any health condition that make it difficult to move independently, and this is linked to the weaknesses and deficiencies in sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental. Therefore, we see that this is a right that is right in the process of building. It's not well recognized because we need to have it permanently. And by having this, we have serious deficiencies in the instrumentation. The university offers different conditions to improve this right, to make it more feasible, and also obstacles among the different conditions, the set of urban possibilities and architectural that are there and that can be used in a better manner. In the investigation, we use this as a reference on top of gender to plan articulation in time and space. And this is always, always there with the gender condition. And this is susceptible of being transformed if it's worked very seriously with gender culture that prevails within the university. And in this sense, social structures and the identity are instances that can be strengthened in order to generate better conditions of mobility that is free and safe. Because something that was constant, it was the idea that people feel safer within or inside the university when they're with other people from the university. This sense, this perception of identity is like an engine that we would need to promote, as well as the conditions, even with the deficiencies, can be improved. However, there are obstacles. Gender culture, there's no question, is clear, is the one that has more problems for the broadening of the law. There's a privatization of public spaces at the universities through the concessions, franchises, that generate spaces where there's uncertainty with respect to the authorities, believe it or not. Sometimes this continues with egocentric perspective, and there's weaknesses in the confirmation of the citizenship at the universities that includes many men and women to be are assumed as subjects of the law within the institution, and there's also an absence of consensus in education in gender and human rights. Here we didn't underline gender, but they come together. Even though when I say a lot of initiatives and a lot of the organizations of students that had taken facilities last year until a few months ago, they were able to get one of their requests to have specialized classes in gender. This is being implemented. We still have a long way to walk in here. And as I said, it was extremely important to the proposals that people that we work with, what they were doing to improve the university. And these are the different areas where we were able to see the proposals. I don't show you all the contents, but you can see that our diagnosis was not so far away from what everybody was identifying, and they were setting proposals to enable the space better in order to improve the conditions, to change the institutionality, to strengthen sustainability in order to strengthen the university community, to increase the classes that are persistent, and also to bring incentives in the feminist research within the university. From this, we created a model that was the result of the product with this research that is what we called that moderates the intervention, participative intervention for the exercise of the free mobility, which is a model that is productive. It's educational because we consider that the reason of being of the university is the reason why those who go into the university and anybody at the university really conveys the information to the rest of society with different ways of thinking and doing things and acting. In this way is that we prioritize education in the human rights, the safety at the universities with this model. They define the university model not as something that can be implemented in a vertical manner from the authorities and going down. This is being constructed as a collective, and this is shared responsibility by all the stakeholders in the university community. And this is a little bit about the linking that we have proposed for the diagnosis all the way to specific programs of projects for intervention. So we have these dimensions, categories, and access for intervention, a social dimension, legal, for planning and design, a set of categories that give us here and the access of social awareness, development of capacities, planning of spaces that are centered in people, the public transportation that is safe, public policies that are with gender perspectives. Taking into account plurality of subject to subject and spaces of intervention that goes from the community at the university by everyone, going through the university authorities, all the organized groups, and all the different instances that are specific and that have direct contact and have the institutional obligation of setting the bridges that have between the university community all the way to the authorities in the corresponding sense. And from the time being, we have set for programs among which we're going to have a certain number of projects in order to implement this model, at least in the space of Ciudad Universitaria, which is the campus. It's a program that we have done from UNAM to build different things, mobility spaces that allow us to stay without any fear. I'm sorry. And the university community for a community that is free and safe. From a perspective where the right of mobility is a way in, it doesn't take the need or the possibility of intervention. It's a proposal to choose a place from where to access a structural change in the way that the right is not depending on the right, because the right of sexual health, the right of political participation, the right to live a life free of violence, among other things. I want to finish sharing just a view of the first publication from this research, this investigation, that is a book entitled To Live and to Go Through the Campus at the University. This is a collective book. In the investigation, we have over 40 people participate throughout the 3 years of the financing. And this is the text that brings the results of the text that was participative. It was published last year by UNAM, and it's available at the Interdisciplinary Center in Sciences and Humanities. And, you know, Claudia asked me to promote the book, of course, and she invited me to share with you that this text is existing, and very soon we're going to be publishing the modeled in a third book where we have the theoretical considerations with respect to the perspectives, concepts, and categories that we have shared. I close by saying that the investigation, the diagnosis was an academic effort to contribute and to risk these conditions of the university from all the points of view. And this brings a lot the idea of the results of the feminist investigation was to live and to improve things. Of course, this has to improve research, but they must be included in order to continue setting up spaces of investigators, young investigators that with practices can broaden the scope of the feminist academia with the necessary social changes whatever they are. And the conclusion here is to acknowledge the forms in which this is established, and it continues, because to know both of them in the articulation, violence, and lack of safety would allow us to find the right keys to eradicate them from a gender feminist perspective centered in the possibility of building a peace culture. And with this, I close. Thank you for these reflections by Dr. Patricia Castañeda. And now we will go to the first block of questions that you can send. It doesn't matter if you're in Zoom or if you're YouTube. And let's stay with the cameras on for both speakers so we can give an answer to the questions. I'm going to read this from the platform of YouTube. Will the written diagnosis going to be available? I write from the University of Guadalajara and I'm interested in this. That was done, I don't know which one of the studies are you talking about, but Dr. Patricia Castañeda will tell us to live and to move at the campus. For foreigners, our colleagues that maybe are listening from other country, how can they have access to the book? And to ask the question, if there's going to be a diagnosis submitted by Dr. Galilea Cariño, if there's going to be anything that can be read, where and how.
¿En qué orden respondemos como participamos?
Okay.
Como ustedes gusten. Adelante.
Okay. Did we answer the way that we participated?
El libro fue publicado el año pasado.
The book was published last year,
Nos atrapó.
and the pandemic really caught us, and we were not able to have the free access version as fast as we wanted, but I'm sure that it's going to be available at the webpage of SAGE, www.ceich.unam.mx. There are many publications from the Center of Free Access, and this is going to be one of them, hopefully in a few weeks.
Muy bien. Entonces, escuchamos la respuesta de Gali.
Let's
Gracias.
listen
Sí,
to Galilea.
compartirles que este
I want to
diagnóstico
share with you that this diagnosis and exploratory study started in January.
el tema de
As you know,
campo, pues porque justo cuando empezamos nos fuimos a
field work
confinamiento,
was
pues,
not
y
there,
trabajando en ello. Hay una
and we have been moving forward.
resumen en ejecutivo para el primer corte y se
There's something from the first cutoff, and we can see through with a form that is very close for the students that have worked in the community.
el 25 de noviembre, pero es todavía un corte, ¿no? De este primer ejercicio.
This is a cutoff for the first activity.
La liga, sin embargo, pues se seguirá trabajando con mayor profundidad.
And this link is going to help us to continue knowing how to work in this document.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Tenemos aquí una participación y pregunta de Vanessa.
We have a participation and a question from Vanessa Alejandra. It says, hello, the protocols within the universities have to be put together by the people that have lived violent situations, and they're women that are very sensitive to violence, and they do not know the consequences of violence. We need a social change for a true inclusion of women in the academia. I'm talking about the cognitive burden. Public universities private universities decide to respond to the complaints by women, and they say who makes these protocols to be complied with from a different institution, who verifies them and follows up externally. This is for both speakers in order to bring several of them together. Carlos Díaz del Itesum says this is great because we're working in a diagnosis within our university. We're interested in looking at this text, how long it took you to do it with the pandemic. We have not been able to move as fast as we wanted. A question for Galilea with respect to the board that allows you to look at problems that are not easy to perceive. You said that there were men that were looking to see if they were on the board. Has it been the case? My perception is that the other way around, there had been adverse reactions. There's other comment, Henry Cristal Rebollar, that says we need to harmonize the laws at the university. We can't file a complaint against somebody that is bothering us, but not always there's an action. There is an area that is dedicated to non-academic workers in both investigations. This is a question. And a comment by Ireri that says we should get together as universities and request the labor reform. Thank you, those of you that are sharing this information and this dialogue, and I leave the microphones so you can tell us if you want to help us in with your answers.
Muy bien, Pati. Empiezo entonces. A ver, fui tomando nota, Clau. Espero que
I
sí se me
was
pasa.
making notes.
Creo que había algunos comentarios, ¿no? Sobre esta.
I think there were some comments in this area with respect to public and private universities.
Tienen ciertos sesgos o atienden las situaciones de manera
There's a certain bias, and there's some studies nationwide.
Esos procesos silenciosos, ¿no? Incluso creo que evidencian cómo estos procesos pues no son.
They bring evidence that these processes do not get rid of the practices of access to justice. They issue the visibility of all of these areas that we didn't have access to because through omission of denial or the condition established for women to have access, or victims can have access to these instances or mechanisms, somehow they're an obstacle as a reference of access to justice or other institutional policies or frameworks in the right manner. We don't have the protocols finished, protocols that are going to be reinforced, and the way to respond to the needs of other people that where you're making the connection that victims should participate in these processes where the diagnoses are being developed because they have lived some of the adverse situations, they face the protocols, and I think in this activity one thing that we have done is that when we work together with respect to compliance, and this refers to complying with standards, policies, programs that somehow they can respond to ethical criteria and with respect to the integrity of people. And some institutions, according to their criteria and practical things in life, with the strength and pressure in this condition, I think this is what brings it together. It's not that there's direct interest. In first instance, as we have seen in these mobilizations that Claudia mentioned, with the first reaction is that we're going to have this, even if there's no certainty, we're going to have this. Through which media, with which resources, we don't know. There's nothing clear. So there's now a clarity in this. One of these answers is going to have to be putting together these protocols that are part of these perspectives. So we have our harmonization. What we see is that in some institutions there's a code of ethics or there's policies of equality, and they go to, to the standard 025, 046, or this or that. And we have a series of elements that, with respect to international standards, with frameworks and conventions. And I think a recent case where we saw what's happening is a case of Paola Guzman against Ecuador, the emblematic resolution that emphasizes the prevention as the duty that we must put together. And I think this is not harmonized. This is something that has been pointed. I think we have to be cross-sectional with some minimum elements, some techniques, and this is what makes it more difficult to understand and to strengthen things that we observe in the voices of the community. Uncertainty and just running risks, taking risk. And when we're talking about reproducing a state system that is linked to our own mechanisms that we may need to strengthen and to harmonize this standards or rules. And I would say that the way that we promote
puntualidad nos señalan esta participación del
and everything that has together, and we start working with the standards and what needs to go over everything else. And then something that we have identified in a process about lobbying. There's different expressions, they're not there. And we respond to putting together all the protocols. And there's some external protocols and standards.
En el marco del pizarrón, por ejemplo,
and in the framework of the board, for example,
la Secretaría de Educación Pública, que justo tiene todos estos elementos de prevención,
and maybe the Ministry of Education has the different elements of prevention, attention, investigation, prevention of violence. This is focused to the population.
Mujeres no colaboradoras, ¿no? Como también lo preguntaban, ¿qué pasa con
and maybe non-workers? What happens with other women that are non-academic? And we see how we start working in a very standardized way with the different groups. And I think in the meantime, while we get the document, what we could see is this how this breaks in order to fulfill the demands, because this is an obligation for everyone, for the supervision of different instances in order to prevent and to take care of the violence, everything about inclusive language, everything about the production of the knowledge in order to get rid of the stereotypes. And this has been said since 2007, because the gender violence, at least what we have seen, there's many cases of university women that go through violence and feminicides that so far in January 2020, when this was created, they don't have it. So the question is how all the institutions are going to respond, public and private. How are they going to respond to the protocol? If all of these bases are what we have, the focus, the perspective, all the paradigms, how are we going to be looking at this? And then when we talk about non-academics, the diagnosis, at least in the questionnaire,
aparece la violencia laboral.
There's violence,
Está
labor
presente
violence, or violence at work.
y disfrazada de
It's
muchos
there,
otros
and it's
elementos,
there
desde cuestiones
disguised of many other elements.
violencia
Things
verbal,
that have to do with
formas
verbal violence,
humillaciones, comparaciones,
humiliations,
eso nos dice
comparisons. I
mucho,
think
toda la
this
laboral,
says a lot,
docentes o académicas, sino
not
también
only
compañeras
workers,
en áreas
academia,
de alguna manera
in administrative
sienten
areas,
la
and somehow
por no pertenecer al gremio
they
de la
feel the
Creo que hay
exclusion because they're not part of the academia. And I think this is part of different things, of different elements differentiated that is being generated. And then in the case
darle la palabra a Pati,
of the last question, and with this I would close, they say if
no será
there's
un caso de transformación, sino todo lo contrario.
maybe it's not a case of transformation, but it's the opposite, but maybe to see an adverse situation. I think what we go through at the university, you know, it was a lot of things. It was difficult because, yes, the
que percibe que
testimony
este
that we
espacio
got
debería,
from one student perceives that the
pero él
space
logra
should
identificar
be
también
transformed, but he's
de
able to identify
con otros compañeros
all the
estudiantes,
different
ya
linkages
que
that
muy
he has with other students, and everybody was very upset, and he wanted to have
pero no porque
access
quería
to the board to make sure that he was not there, not because he wanted to revindicate or to
eso
really have a
a la
transformation. I
manera
think that's why
en la cual se va
it will look
percibiendo
differently
pues,
the
el problema.
way that the problem of the board is perceived. I think that days after this happened, 9 a.m. came, and then there's a space about masculinity, and then we go to the confinement. So
replantearse
so many possibilities of restating all of this or returning to, but really
de alguna manera
there are other cases that somehow
de enojo,
bring
de
this condition on, you know, of not resisting anymore, and
en ese sentido.
there's so many things.
Gracias.
This is all that I have.
Gracias. Escuchamos a la doctora Patricia
Thank you.
Castañeda.
We're going to hear from Dr. Patricia Castañeda.
Gracias, Galilea, porque diste una
Thank you
respuesta
so
muy
much,
a estas
Galilea,
complejidades.
because your answer was so complete, and I don't have much to add except
Por una parte,
maybe a couple of things.
las
On one
propias
hand,
universidades tienen instancias verificadoras en relación con las acciones del protocolo.
both universities have different instances, and this is another concept of not knowing the protocol or the protocols,
De la
how they're
estructura
self-regulated. They're part of the institutional legislative structure of the universities, and in most of them,
de derechos universitarios, que es una
there's a defense for university rights. That is the first instance that you can go to verify
y por supuesto el consejo
the
universitario.
protocols.
Algunos consejos universitarios tienen
Some
comisiones
university advise,
de igualdad de género o solo de
you
género.
know, gender equality or just gender, but it would be the next instances if we can see
De cuáles son
all
las
of this,
estructuras
and this depends on what are the internal structures. They cannot go and walk by themselves. And also take into account that protocols are regulatory in what has to be with the sanction, with the care, with the attention, with the sanction to different manifestations with respect to gender violence inside the universities. And in this sense, they're partial.
No. Quiero decir que hay que tener conciencia de que deben ir acompañados.
It's not that we're going to dismiss them, but we have to be aware that this has to go hand in hand of processes that have to do with prevention in order to be efficient. Because if we only concentrate on this, attention and sanction, we're really not changing the conditions in which the gender violence happens. So it affects and all the private entities, because this is a problem between private entities. No, with the intervention of the authorities of the university. And I'm just generally speaking. And I think this is the trend. And the protocol has to be articulated with other parts of the structure. And this has to do with prevention.
También llamar la atención sobre el papel que juegan los sindicatos. Porque una
and
parte
this
de
has to do with the role of the union workers
la
or
negociación
workers unions, but within the university, the negotiation of the contracts with the workers union, there's this figure from the past century. Yes, this can be an obstacle.
los grandes frenos que se
And
han
a
vivido
lot of the things that stop the universities to take the first step of the protocols is this.
también requieren
And
modificaciones
this needs changes, of course, in their, all over, and they need to be a lot more sensitive to the different activities that are part of everything at the universities.
Entonces, eso es un punto sobre el cual hay que,
This is an item
y hasta donde yo sé,
where we need to pay a lot more attention. And as far as I know, there's not a lot of research.
es un punto débil que creo que tenemos
And
que
this is a weak spot that we need to solve.
académicas para
With
conocer
the
con mayor
non-academic
profundidad
workers, we need to look at this deeper in the work conditions, the lack of equality, which are within the university,
particular, de manera
and
específica,
all of this that affects them because of the place that they occupy within the university. So there's a broad, field to be covered. And the last thing
es que
that I want to mention
efectivamente
is
hace
that
falta
yes,
un cambio
there is
estructural
missing
para el
a
reconocimiento
lot
del
of
trabajo.
the changes.
Pero en el chat aparece una pregunta de
In the
Carmen Díaz.
chat, there's a question from Carmen Diaz. Hello, Carmen. Now, I'm finding a lot of you here, and I feel happy about that.
Cursos
She's asking
especiales.
about the specialized classes.
Yo creo que
I believe
por el momento
that right now
necesarios,
it's
pero lo que
necessary, but
necesitamos
what really need
con perspectiva de
is
género.
a university education with gender perspective
Y forme
that
a todo el mundo,
educates
desde las
everyone,
autoridades más altas
from the
hasta
top
estudiantes
authorities all the
de
way to students from high
aquellos
school, from every level at the universities that start education of, high school education within their structure.
lo tiene
So
muchas
there's many
públicas
universities that start education in high school, and they have all of this in middle education. So
todos los niveles
they need to have this.
que le dé sentido a los cursos especializados, porque
And to give
cursos
sense to
especializados
specialized courses,
pues no hacen verano, los toman algunas
and the
personas
specialized courses, it's not enough. Those people that take them, some parts
a incorporar alguno de los
feel obligated to bring all of this within their knowledge,
y de lo que
but
se trata
they are not bringing awareness of what we need at the universities
el rumbo de la prevención.
in order to really
Bueno,
walk.
no solamente cursos especializados, sino hiperfocalizados. Entonces, insisto, eso es como en la ciencia.
Hyper-focalized.
Para entender una parte, pero necesitamos el
And
bosque.
this is important to understand. We need the trees, the thicker trees, and we need the entire
Pues eso
forest.
yo podría decir como una lección aprendida es que se necesita tener una política universitaria de igualdad.
We need to
específica
have a
igualdad
policy at the level of the University of Equality,
de género y un
gender
programa
equality, and a program
en género que permee toda
of education in gender that would go all the way up and down and that is constantly updating. It's not just classes, it's not just one subject or one topic, it's university education and gender perspective. Thank you. I'm going to be adding a couple of questions.
La siguiente pregunta, ¿cuáles consideran
The
que son
next
los
question, what do you think are the challenges when there's resistance of cross-sectioning a gender perspective because it's being considered as a topic that is only of interest to women? And I'm going to add one more question.
¿Qué
It's my question to you. What are the alternatives that we have today in order for men who are professors or decision makers within the universities get involved in prevention actions, also in the reduction of gender violence?
No sé, ¿qué quisieran agregar? Si hubiera alguna otra pregunta de quienes nos escuchan que quieran
If you have any more questions, whether it's YouTube or YouTube, this would be our last round.
Bueno, si me permiten, en relación con la
With
transversalización,
respect to
el primer desafío
cross-sectioning,
entienda
the first
que es
challenge
un asunto de mujeres.
is it needs to be understood that this is not about women, that gender violence is a social problem. It's the biggest challenge to really get rid of resistance.
No alcance el calado que requiere.
We want to be able to reach as deep as we need. When you go cross-sectionally in the actions, in the programs, in the messages, and in the
Y
practices,
nuevamente, tenemos un problema en
is
formación.
when
También
we have
tenemos un
a
problema
problem in
de
education, but
resistencia
we also have a
feminista.
problem of resisting and rejection of feminists. We can talk about this forever, the reasons, the history about this,
Etcétera. Y entonces, todo lo
and
que tiene que ver con las brujas nos atañe.
everything
Mejor
that has to do with this, you know,
es
but
que
what's true,
también hay mucha resistencia al feminismo
there's a
porque
lot of resistance to feminism because it's not known,
las personas con una versión
because
distorsionada de este
people
sentido
are left with a distorted
en relación con quiénes y cómo somos las feministas.
what feminism is with respect to what we are as feminists and
Sociales. Y justo que
social
las instituciones
policies and the institutions
a implementar un programa
that are dedicated to implement a program for women.
feminista en las
It
instituciones.
has to be a feminist policy in the institutions in order for this to be cross-sectional, and there has to be feminists throughout the institutional
Pero para eso,
structure
socialmente se necesita entender que las
for
feministas
them
lo
to
que
understand this
estamos
socially. We must understand that as feminists, what we're proposing is a
sociedad en su
perspective for the
conjunto,
future
que
for
nuestro
the
grupo
society at large, that our group, our center of interest,
de las mujeres
have to understand that the situation of women is part of the situation in social life. In order to change things, we need to modify the set of social life. Feminism is just putting everything for a different society for everyone. Women, we are the mirror of society. And everything that happens is the entry door to understand the best in society and culture, and to move forward in the understanding is something that we have to do every day in order to overcome
Bien, para
the
vencer
resistance, in
cada
order
día
to overcome political resistance that comes from neoconservative policies and the allies making out of the inclusive ignorance one of the biggest strengths. And
trabajar constantemente las
we have to work against something as feminist is against this, particularly ignorance and induced ignorance.
no sé si eso abone un poco a desmitificar que son asuntos de mujeres.
We need to demystify that these are topics about women and what are the alternatives for men to be involved. This is always a very difficult question to answer because I think we shouldn't have to ask this. We have to ask men this. We have to ask men why they resist. Why don't they acknowledge? I would turn the question around. What would men answer before this? What would they have to contribute as an alternative? I say that in this society, we have people with sexogeneric, diverse, but the dominants are those that are associated with this condition, and they are in relationships. Therefore, if they're relationship oriented, then we need to be responsible and we need to act with respect to a problem. Sometimes it's going to be for the detriment of some, and maybe it's going to be in favor of others. It's less and less clear each time. So I think that what we need to do is to ask others. That's a suggestion. Yes.
Muchas gracias, Patti.
Thank you, Patti. Dr. Galilea?
Ampliar esta.
Gracias, Clau. Sí, creo que lo que ha mencionado Patti.
I think what Patti has mentioned with respect to the biggest challenge, this is part of the biggest challenge that we have identified. I think it really shows this confrontation of women that keeps the hope alive about the practical violence, and also to look at the universities and the idea of cross-sectionaling, not feeling at the center of everything, goes through so many other conditions or facets, and part of all of these situations and all of these other areas, art, culture, that are also part of this Congress. So I think that sometimes we think that we take on policies, this is going to have an effect. And I think we are forgetting about an important part. And this is about developing, using, and appropriation. And I think sometime if we are facing this cross-functionality scenario, and this complements the institutions, because otherwise, if we don't institutionalize, if we don't look at this, if there's attempts of generating a policy that would last as long as we have an administration, as long as we have this mobilization of guardian women or groups that somehow are surveilling, and this can last a long time, or this can have a lot of problems, and we can say, how are we getting there? How are we getting with so many bases in such a way that it's going to be assessing periodically what we're generating? And this is a mechanism of human rights in front of other mechanisms. In our case, a few years ago, we had the possibility to start with this proposal of diagnosis to cross-sectionalize the perspective of human rights and gender perspective at Ibero, because we were seeing that this situation cannot be taken apart. Of course, there are voices that we were going to be repeating, and maybe by looking at the view of human rights, we can look at the perspective, and the topic is that gender perspective, feminism should be present in this situations in popular design, and also the design in extracurricular design. This is something that we have seen in some of the practices, and with respect to how to work men with this entire process. I believe that Pati's answer really confronts us with the work of having to think about the new communities, stating a question about how we have reflected in all of this. And there's very few activities where we have asked and we have identified and we can see where we're going. There's some activities that we have done with other countries, and maybe more formally in the United States, where the sexual violence is conditioned to the different things at the universities. And this type of surveillance are not even present in our own institutions, and maybe they're not complemented with all of these elements of surveillance and everything. And I think we see isolated promotions, isolated efforts, believing that maybe a workshop can solve this. No, but these are not things that are coordinated in the curriculum, in practice, in the activities of the Defense Commission. And we're working on this in the institutions, and we're lacking to have a coordination and intersectorial, and sometimes are the workshops for students or the workshops for professors. And I think we need to look at this, at the teachers, at the students, and sometimes there are differentiated interests, and all the policy for prevention has to look at a framework in order to be able to state other steps. And we also want to aspire to other spaces and we can work with other people that are victim. And this anxiety that it's generated. With this, we close the panel. I want to thank the speakers with this reflection that is being shared with us, the people that have heard us, and with this dialogue, and that have contributed with questions, and the Program of Gender and Social Inclusion in Mexico City for making this Congress possible. And I'll give the floor to Elvia. Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you, Patricia, Galilea. This was a very interesting panel. And the big advantage that we have, if you were not here with us, is that they're recorded in YouTube. And hopefully you're going to be here tomorrow at 9 with the next panel, the paradigm of care in the construction of peace, where we're going to have speakers that have very interesting conferences, Dr. Varela, Cañiz, Dr. Irene Gómez, Dr. Magallón, Dr. Mercedes Alcañiz, of course, and we'll see you there tomorrow. Thank you so much for being here for this wonderful panel. Thanks, everyone, and we send you our best regards. Thank you to all the team, Jorge, Ari, and everyone that has been here providing us with their support. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you, Galilea, for sharing her space. Great regards for everyone.